Noswaith pawb, a croeso unwaith eto I Nanteos, I Blas Nanteos. And thank you very much for joining us on our last of a series of 7 talks about Nanteos history and about the history of Ceredigion in the 1750s. Thank you very much to Jeremy once again and to Claire this time representing Nanteos. We're on Facebook this time with Nanteos' Facebook page rather than Instagram at the moment. Technical difficulties, but that's lovely. And thank you very much to the Squire, current Squire of Nanteos, Mr. Shane Lipscombe, for lending us his ears and providing an audience of one for us. So we're here to talk about Christmas in 1750s. And what we need to do is erase from our minds what we think of as a historic Christmas, because probably what we've got in there is a vision of a Victorian Christmas. So Dickens, a Dickensian Christmas, even a Jane Austen type Christmas is too young a Christmas for us. We're talking about 1750 rather than 1850. So the idea of the Christmas tree as such, of the presents around the tree, of a lot of things that we associate with Christmas in times past is actually Victoriana. We're going back to a world where even in a big house like this, Christmas was celebrated in quite a different way. And what we've got here, light and greenery, would be the main themes, as well as alcohol and food. So these are the things that we need to think of when we're thinking of people in this wonderful Grade 2, and part of the house is a Grade 1 listed building, how they would be celebrating here. We're thinking of the Yule Log. That'll be something that we're familiar with. We'll be thinking of the hunt, not just the Boxing Day hunt of Victoriana, not just a hunt on Boxing Day night, but we're thinking of hunting the squirrel, hunting the fox, hunting the rabbit, hunting whatever we could get hold of as a Boxing Day celebration. So don't think either of a medieval Christmas. That often comes to mind as well. The Great Hall and the more communal Christmas of the Welsh princes perhaps, or of the great lords and ladies of medieval England, with the central fire and with the benches and the trestle tables and with the lord and lady at the end on their dais. Okay, so we need to erase that from our minds. But what we're going to look at tonight is how the ordinary people of Ceredigion celebrated Christmas. And the Gwyliau, the holidays, they went on for at least 3 weeks in Georgian times. And sometimes they went on for as long as the beginning of February for Candlemas, for the Feast of Epiphany on the 6th of January, with New Year celebrations overshadowing those of Christmas. And New Year was extremely important to them, more important than Christmas. And the whole of the period from just before Christmas right through to the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January, and even, as we said, to the beginning of February, was filled with partying. And from my reading, I believe that the Georgians could party like we've just forgotten what to do. There was no sense of a lockdown for them. In these big houses, people would have entertained. They had the space to entertain. Their houses were dry, the rooms were big, they had plenty of kindling, they were warm, they had candles, they had the light. So they would have entertained their friends over the Christmas and New Year period. But for the ordinary people, as we've looked at before in Mud and Marble and the others in the series of lectures, those people basically lived in huts and hovels. Sometimes the better farms had flagged floors, sometimes they could sit at tables and entertain a limited number of friends. But most people lived in cottages if they were lucky, and many, as we've seen, lived in huts. So their Christmas and their New Year was about getting out in the dark. And like we've looked at All Hallows Eve in a previous lecture, that was all about going out in the night with great big torches, pitch torches, and going out in the night and singing from farm to farm, from homestead to homestead. And the whole of the period was about that. So people were roaming around. We have Calennig, we have Plugine, we have the carol singing, we have, I'll later talk about the Mary Lwyd and the Wren Box. People were on the move, they were dressed up, They were holding flaming torches, and they were drinking, and they were going from house to house, getting more and more drunk and picking up food as they went. So there were some places where the gentry that would have celebrated in a wonderful mansion like Nanteos, and where the common people would have mixed over Christmas. And one would have been in the Plugine. So Plugine was held over Christmas time, and in some areas it was a church service, and in some areas it started at 3 o'clock in the morning or at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it went on for hours and hours and hours till both the congregation and the curate in charge and the clergy in charge were begging for their breakfast. And so some people would stay up all night making toffee, that sort of thing, eating and feasting, and then it's about 3 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning, they'd make their way in the great torchlight processions through the night, down from the farms far up in the hills. They'd walk for miles to the local church. And in my two books, The Shadow of Nanteos and The Dipping Pool there, a lot of the books take place over the Christmas period. So in the books we see the family and we see the ordinary people celebrating Christmas, celebrating All Hallows Eve, celebrating May's Eve, celebrating New Year, and celebrating Twelfth Night. So they're very atmospheric books really for this time of year. And I think in Plas Nanteos, I love it in the summer. It's beautiful, it's balmy. It's one of the most lovely tiny country houses that I know, but it's even more atmospheric in the winter when the great fire is lit and when you're looking out at the dark night with the trees all around the house. There's nothing more atmospheric. So for a Nadolig, for Plugine, they would both tiers would interact in the church, and so you would find the gentry going in their horses and their carriages through the dark, and they would be meeting on the road more and more people who would convene on the church. And churches in those days were more than they are for us. Even for Christian people now, the church can be a rather formal place. But for people in Georgian times, the churchyard was seen as a sort of playground almost. There's a lot of evidence of people playing fiddles and pipes in the churchyard, of dancing and playing games, running around the church, that sort of thing, folk dancing. And there's even evidence of clergymen, rather naughty clergymen, after a couple of jars, actually getting involved and betting themselves in cockfights that were also held in the churchyard. So we need to think of the church as a really lively place, and to some extent a slightly bawdy place, possibly. So the Plugine, they would rise very early, sometimes staying up all night, making cyflaith, which was the treacle toffee. And there's a wonderful account of a Plugine service. And of course Plugine still goes on in some parts of Wales today. And this Plugine service comes from an account, a man describing Plugine in about 1850. And rather than me paraphrasing, I'd like to read his actual words. Okay, so he's describing a William Payne, Plugine in Dolgellau. Now the church is in a blaze, now crammed, body, aisles, gallery. Now Sean Robert, the club-footed shoemaker, and his wife are descending from the singing seat to the lower and front part of the gallery. They strike up alternately, and without artificial aid of pitch pipe, the long, long carol and old favourite describing the worship of kings and of the wise men and the flight into Egypt and the terrible wickedness of Herod. The crowds are wholly silent and wrapped in admiration. Then the good rector and his curate, David Pugh, stand up and read the morning service abbreviated, finishing with a prayer for all conditions of men and the benediction. Restless and somewhat surging is the congregation during prayers. The rector obliged sometimes to stop short in his office and look direct at some part or persons, but there is no verbal admonishment. Prayers over, the singers begin again again, more carols, new singers, old carols in solos, duets, trios, choruses, then silence in the audience, broken at appropriate pauses by the suppressed hum of delight and approval, till between 8 and 9, hunger telling on the singers, the plug-in is over, and the bells strike out a round peal. The author includes another little bit of testimony here. In my Torog, a sermon was included in the plug-in service, but the rector was careful to keep both sermon and service short, as he evidently felt that the chief attraction was not the service, but the carolling that followed it. In other places, such as Llanfair, Dyffryn, Llwyd, Holy Communion was administered during the plug-in. So again, we see Welsh people as absolutely addicted to song and addicted to poetry as well, as we'll find out when we look a little bit more at the plug-in traditions. And I've got a very good friend, Dr. Alan Kent, who's a Cornishman. He has learned Cornish, speaks Cornish, and writes on all aspects of Cornish literature and language, and he's also a playwright. And we were discussing different traditions, he in Cornwall and me in Wales, and it seems very interesting because the Cornish people, Celts as they are with their own language like us, they seemed very early on to put most of their energy, most of their folk energy into theatre, into drama. And we've got some very early Cornish plays, and this tradition goes right through Georgian period, Victorian period, and into modern times. Whereas in Wales, we mainly, apart from our great Mabinogion tradition, we are mainly looking in terms of poetry and song. When the folk people get together, when our ordinary people get together, and obviously when the Welsh princes got together with their minstrels in their fine halls in Middle Ages, what was celebrated was poetry rather than theatre. So that's really interesting, and thank you to Dr. Alan Kent for talking to me about that. After they'd come back from the plug-in, they would have a special breakfast. And again, in places like this, it would be a lavish breakfast. Many of the servants would have had to stay behind during the plug-in service because they would have had to prepare a feast ready for the Powells when they came back from their service at Llanbadarn Church, just down the road, so you can see where they would have worshipped plug-in. But for the ordinary people, their breakfast again is sort of heart-wrenchingly plain and humble. Even their very special Christmas morning breakfast makes one feel sad, really, for its humble nature. So some people would have had hot ale and again the ubiquitous toasted cheese. So just as we saw in the very first lecture where we were looking at sort of folk customs and superstitions surrounding All Hallows Eve, toasted cheese was used in order to look into the future and for divination purposes. So we've got toasted bread and cheese as a special breakfast on Christmas morning. And that seems very sad that it was a treat for these people. Or brewes. So I looked up brewes. What is brewes? Well, it's an oat cake which is steeped in broth, hot milk and water. They would have also had strong ales, cakes and cold meats, with the goose, if they could afford a goose, if they had a goose to kill, being kept for the Christmas dinner. And as well as neighbourly visits on Christmas Day, as I've said before, people went out and about, visiting their neighbours. People didn't stay in their cold, dark, damp houses. Out they went, whatever the weather. And dressed in layers of sheep wool clothes, flannel, you would be fairly waterproof. They do, I've got a couple of versions myself, and the water will run off real wool. So they were out and about in all weathers like people are now. So Christmas Day was spent in hunting things and in violent football matches. And the hunting and violence was another way in which the gentry would meet the ordinary people around Christmas time. So for instance, on Boxing Day, there would be a squirrel hunt and a fox hunt. And people from all walks of life would hunt these animals. And again, that's documented in both my books. It's a wonderful opportunity for a writer there, where you can get people out of their social strata, you can take down the walls that would have divided different social classes, and you can get them mixed up outside. So hunting on Boxing Day, hunting the squirrels with sticks, weighted sticks, and dogs, or hunting the fox. The wealthier people, obviously, on horseback, and all walks of society with their sort of various curs of various different types enjoying the hunt there. And you can add a little bit of alcohol in a hip flask, you can add a little bit of adrenaline because they're out there hunting, and suddenly people will say things and do things that they wouldn't normally do. So I've got a lot of that sort of outside hunting, if you like, because it gives me an opportunity as a writer to make people interact in unexpected ways. So particularly on Boxing Day, on St. Stephen's Day, people would like to draw blood. And I'm not saying that sort of lightly or whimsically, I'm saying that really quite literally. So you find Boxing Day for the hunting, but you also find St. Stephen's Day, and of course St. Stephen died by being stoned to death. He was one of the first Christian martyrs. We find it's often called Holming Day. Holming, H-O-L-M-I-N-G. And what holming was beating yourself in order to draw blood. So there's quite a lot of testimony that particularly the older people in Victorian times, so I'm guessing that it was more common then in Georgian times, would regularly beat themselves on Boxing Day with things like holly. I'm not going to demonstrate this to you now, I'll just leave it to your imagination. There was also a custom whereas men and boys would go around with branches of holly, trying to get hold of women and girls and beating them on their bare arms until the blood ran. So if you were a careful mother on Boxing Day, your daughter was not allowed to go out with the other young people from farm to farm, having a few drinks, doing a bit of wassailing. Your daughter had to stay at home, otherwise she would have been caught and her arms exposed, and she would have been beaten on the arms until her blood ran. The other thing that was common to do on Boxing Day was to bleed the farm animals, particularly the horses. That sounds very cruel to us now, as many things do from the Georgian period, but people genuinely believed in Georgian times that it was good to let blood, not just the bloodletting of animals, but it was healthy to let a little bit of blood. So animals were holmed, bloodlet on Boxing Day, and of course, because they weren't in work for perhaps 3 weeks, they weren't weakened by that. They would have had time to bring their blood count back up, bring their blood levels back up before they were in work at the beginning of February. So, under the title Weird and Wonderful Georgian Christmas, that is one of the strangest things we've come across. The other thing that was absolutely loved and indulged in from Boxing Day onwards was the giant football match, which was basically a version of death ball. And I've come across one very, very interesting account here, where the two goals were 8 miles apart, and it was in this area of Ceredigion. And anybody could join in. There was no upper limit to how many people were playing this football game. And of course it would be probably a pig's bladder, blown up, tied up. And people were on horseback, people were, they could hit it with sticks, they could kick it, they could throw it, and it raged for an 8-mile period between one church steeple and the next church steeple. And it went on all day. So these young guys got up in the morning early with first light, and they were still playing it when it got dark at 5 o'clock. And of course there was a lot of alcohol. Again, we talked about this: greenery, light, alcohol and food. And there's evidence as well that some young men sadly got killed in the playing of football. When the Methodists then took hold later on in the century, in the 18th century and into the 19th century, it was first of all frowned upon, and then of course there was an outright ban of it. And it became a sort of Sunday school outing with carolling and hymn singing and less dangerous games, and very much controlled then by the chapels and the churches. So another thing that people would have used is, very, very importantly, the Yule Log. So again, in the books, we have, in the dipping pool, we have a beautiful oak tree taken down from just near Nanteos, and it's a trunk used as a Yule Log. And people would keep the ashes from the Yule Log, and they would bury them with the first of the seed corn in the spring. And it was considered to be very lucky, and it would bring about a very good corn harvest. And of course, as I've said before in my lectures, these days a corn harvest is something that will get you 2 trips abroad with your family if you're lucky. In those days, a good or a bad corn harvest meant the difference between food for the next winter or starvation in some cases for the next winter. So taking the ashes from the Yule Log and putting them in with the first of the seed corn was very important. So in 1752, when my books take place, the old New Year became the new Year, and the calendar changed. And what's really interesting is that for urban people, for people in many areas of England, for the more sophisticated people in Wales, for the powers living in Nanteos, they would have made that transition from the old New Year to the new Year. But there is some evidence that though officially the calendar was changed in 1752, the ordinary people of Wales, the wearing bobble, kept on celebrating the old New Year right up until the 1950s. And the New Year was very, very important to them, as I said before, more important than the Christmas period. And it was like Calan Mai in May, like Calan Gaea at the end of October. It was considered to be a spirit night, and you could meet your spirits, you could meet your ancestors, you could carry out divination, you could carry out spells to make things happen if you wanted them to happen. And my mum actually remembers, and my mum might be watching this, I hope you are, Mam, a diolch yn fawr am wylio. My mum grew up in Eglwysfach, a little village about 12 miles from here, and she can actually remember going around the village on New Year's Eve, collecting calenig. Her and her little friends and her brothers would sing outside people's houses, and it was a little bit like a trick or treat. They would be expected to be given something nice, and lastly to be given some money. But this tradition goes right back, right until the Middle Ages, and perhaps even it goes back to the Roman festivals, pre-Christian Roman festivals, when people would dress up and collect money. So the Mari Lwyd and the Wren box. Many of you will have heard about this. Many of you might even have seen the Mari Lwyd and the Wren box in action. But if you go to the wonderful St Fagans Museum of Welsh Life just outside Cardiff, we've actually got examples of those, of the actual objects that were carried around and used by the folk people as they wassailed from place to place. Now, wassailing basically just means going out in a crowd of people into the night, usually using verse, usually using song, usually getting drunk, and having a sort of ritual procession from place to place. And as you can see here, I've brought our Mari Lwyd. Now, she lives with us on our little farm near Llanrystud. And she actually comes originally from Abergavenny. And the Mari Lwyd is the Grey Mary. Okay? And this Mari Lwyd has processed many times through Abergavenny on the old New Year in the middle of January. And she looks fierce, and she is fierce. And what I like about these traditions is they're very bawdy. We think perhaps now of a very sanitised Christmas, a lot of telly watching, a lot of quality street eating, a lot of playing on our various video games. But they had fun by being out together, a very communal Christmas. And this Mari Lwyd, somebody gets inside this sheet and pulls it over their head. And all you can see is this horse's skull, and there's a spring attached to it, and you pull it up and down and you can snap the jaws. And some modern ones now don't just have the glass eyes. Some modern ones actually have lights in their eyes. They have electronic lights that flash on and off in their eyes. And the Mari Lwyd is carried usually traditionally by a bunch of men, some of whom are dressed as women. Yes, we've got a lot of cross-dressing. We met that in All Hallows Eve as well. Men dressing as women. And the Mari Lwyd will turn up at a homestead in days gone by or at a tavern. And the party with the Mari Lwyd will sing outside the tavern. And inside the tavern, people will sing back at them. And these verses are very, very ornate. And they can sometimes go on literally for hours. And it depends upon who gives up first. Because the people in the tavern are trying to keep the Mari Lwyd party out traditionally, because once the Mari Lwyd party comes in, they will create havoc. They will have to be given the barrel of ale, they have to be given food. The Mari will run at women and try and kiss them. The Mari will lift women's skirts up. The two men dressed as women will roll around the floor and chase after women with brooms and try and kiss them. So the whole thing is absolute riot. And we did it several times in Abergavenny. We had great fun, but of course I don't think we'll be doing it this year because I don't think we'll be allowed to. But we could get a little mask for Mari Lwyd and ask her to behave a little bit in a more socially distanced manner, but we'll see. And inside then people sort of sing back, and there's like a singing contest in verse, which is extraordinary. And there's some evidence that people who owned the taverns in days gone by actually employed professional poets for that night only, who would stand at the doorway or stand at the open window and fight back in verse and try and beat the Mari Lwyd and her party. So great fun there. Now the other strange habit that they had during Wassailing was they would catch a little wren, and in some accounts I've read, the wren is kept alive and put in a wren house. It's like a little cage that they made out of wood. And in some cases that I've read, they would kill her and stuff her and mount her on a spike so she was looking out of the window of the wren house. And again, this was just an excuse really, like my mum with Killenny, to go from house to house and extort money and drink and food. And it was men who did this, and there were verses attached to this, and they would often turn up at the house of recently married couples. And if the man didn't give them food and drink as they expected, they would use this rhyme. So almost like a little curse. Gwynt fralwm felon hwrthwm I ddroi'r tŷ a'i wyneb fyny. I'm going to do that again because it's such good fun. Right. Tonsils engage. Gwynt fralwm felon hwrthwm I ddroi'r tŷ a'i wyneb fyny. And what it means, roughly in English, is, may a raging wind come suddenly to turn your house upside down. And everything sounds, particularly curses, sound better in Welsh, don't they? I mean, if you think of it, the Welsh language, even excuse me please, sounds like hell. I'll give it you now. Esgusodwch fi os gwelwch yn dda. So, great fun for New Year. So the last time we're going to look at now is Twelfth Night. And just like Shakespeare's play, Twelfth Night, where Malvolio is a Puritan figure, and he's very against fun, very much against fun for the upper classes, the Sir Toby Belches, and the people, Maria and her friends in the kitchen. He represents the sort of growing tide, even in the 17th century, early 17th century and late 16th century, the growing tide of Puritanism that, of course, can be seen to have some parallels in the growing tide of Methodism. And of course, Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's play, is all about upstairs, downstairs, mixing inappropriately over alcohol. And that's exactly what Twelfth Night was. And I've used that again in the dipping pool in order to get people from different social classes to mix inappropriately, to to create some danger, to create some frisson that then becomes extremely important as a plot driver. And this sort of Twelfth Night comes from the ancient Roman festival of Saturnalia, we think. And it was held at a similar time of the year, after the winter solstice, when the nights are starting to get lighter again. And people gave presents, brought greenery into the house, lit bonfires, and filled their homes with light. Most interestingly, around about the Saturnalia festival, they waited upon their servants. Many of these elements were retained by early Christianity when Christ became the symbolic light of the world, and we had a Christian Christmas. So a special bowl would be used for wassailing, and it had 12 handles. And again, very, very much a communal thing. This wonderful big bowl would be passed around people, and it would be filled with cakes and apples set in rows, one on top of the other, with sugar in between. Then there would be warm beer mixed with hot spices and passed around the company. When all the beer was drunk, when all the liquid had been drunk, the hot ale had been drunk, then people would eat the food. Again, everybody would have a spoon and eat the food. And the Twelfth Night party I use in my book to take place in the dining room at Nanteos. And it's a very key scene in the book because it's where one of my main gentry characters finds herself inappropriately linked to a much lesser character in terms of social influence. And what happened was that for one night only, the gentry would mix with their servants, and they would often get people to come from outside to serve on that night so their servants could then enjoy the party. And they would have a special cake, or they would use this wassail pot, and hidden in there would be a bean, and that would be king for the night, and a pea, and that would be queen for the night. And so the king and the queen for the night could be anything from a servant or a cook to the lord or the lady, or Mr. and Mrs. Powell. And of course they would then be bossing everybody around for one night only. A lot of alcohol again. So as an author, I've run out of time now, so I can't read you the extract. I beg your pardon. But there's so much to know, and there's so much of interest about the 1750s. We think of the past, and we do think, starting probably with Jane Austen at the beginning of the 19th century, but we're going back 50 years. And in these last series of lectures, they're all available on the Nanteos Facebook site, Nanteos Instagram. They're available on my author Facebook page. If you want either of these books here, I can do. They're available widely from Waterstones, Amazon, really any bookshop, and available widely online. If you wanted for Christmas a specially signed copy, personally delivered to your door or as a present for somebody, please visit my website, my author website, and we can arrange to do that for you as well. And thank you very much for following, all the people who are following from America and who follow Nanteos, who are great fans of Nanteos, who are following all around the world. And thank you very much to Nanteos for inviting me to do these, and to Shane for sharing his wonderful Nanteos with me. And thank you very much to Jeremy for all your hard work in doing the tech, which hasn't always been easy because we're out in the country, we're out in the wilds here. And thank you very much to Claire, and particularly to Hannah and Nigel and the team for your technical support and giving your time as well. And most of all, thank you to those people who dipped in and out. You might not have seen everyone, you might not have seen everyone all through, but my cousin Sean in America, my dear friend Angela, all my friends online, Kim and Mam, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti. A diolch yn fawr I chi gyd am wylio, a Nadolig llawen, a blwyddyn newydd dda, a blwyddyn newydd iach. A diolch yn fawr.